November 1944, Fort Lawton, Washington State. The mess hall doors swung open and Adelheid Kruger stopped breathing. 23 years old, captured 3 weeks earlier in the chaos of the French retreat, she had spent the last 72 hours expecting the brutality she had been promised would come from American hands. Instead, she was staring at something that made no sense. Something that violated every understanding she had of how the world worked in the 5th year of total war. Golden pastry crusts, dozens of them, rising from white ceramic dishes that released clouds of steam into the cold November air. The scent hit her before her mind could process what her eyes were seeing. Rich, fatty, impossibly abundant. Beef. Real beef. Not the memory of beef, not the rumor of beef, not the thin gray substitute that German rations had optimistically labeled as beef since 1942. Actual meat, swimming in thick gravy, wrapped in butter-soaked pastry that looked like something from her grandmother's kitchen in Essen before the war had consumed everything normal about living. Beside her, Edeltraud Hoffmann made a small sound in her throat. The 22-year-old nurse from Karlsruhe had steady hands that never shook during the worst field surgeries, had held dying soldiers without flinching, had walked through bombed hospitals with the calm efficiency that kept others alive. Now she was trembling, staring at the serving line where American soldiers in crisp uniforms were placing these impossible creations onto metal trays with the casual indifference of men who had never known hunger. "It cannot be real," Edeltraud whispered in German, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose reality had just fractured. "It is a trick, a test. They want to see if we are animals who will fight over food." But Ingeborg Richter, 26 years old and practical to her core, was already moving forward. The records keeper from Mannheim had spent the last 2 years documenting supply shortages with mathematical precision. She knew exactly how many grams of fat, how many calories, how much protein the Reich allocated to its auxiliary corps. She had calculated her own slow starvation with the same careful attention she gave to filing systems. Her hands, ink-stained and too thin, reached for the tray being offered by an American private, who could not have been older than 19. He was smiling at her, actually smiling, as if serving food to enemy prisoners was a pleasant task rather than a grim duty. The pot pie landed on her tray with a weight that felt obscene. Ingeborg looked down at it and felt something crack inside her chest. The crust was perfect. Golden brown, flaking at the edges, steam escaping from a decorative vent cut into the center. Through that small opening, she could see chunks of beef, carrots, peas, potatoes, each also suspended in gravy so thick it barely moved. This single serving contained more meat than her entire family had seen in a month. More butter than her ration card had allowed in a year. More food than she had eaten in any single meal since 1942. Adelheid's mind traveled backward as she stood frozen in the serving line, the scent of beef pot pie pulling memories from places she had tried to seal shut. Essen, 1942. Her mother's kitchen, once filled with the smell of sauerbraten and fresh bread, had become a laboratory of substitution and scarcity. They had learned to make coffee from roasted acorns, to stretch a single egg across 4 people, to convince themselves that turnip soup was nourishing when served in her grandmother's good china. By 1943, even the turnips became precious. Adelheid remembered her younger sister Greta, 13 years old, crying not from sadness, but from the constant gnawing emptiness that no amount of watered-down soup could fill. Their ration cards allowed 200 grams of meat per week when meat was available, which it rarely was. Bread became darker, denser, stretched with sawdust and potato starch until it sat in the stomach like a stone, providing bulk without nutrition. Her mother had developed the hollowed look that all German women wore by the war's 4th year, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes too large in thinning faces, hands that trembled from lack of fat. Adelheid had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, partly out of patriotic duty, but also because military service meant better rations. As a communications specialist, she received an extra 100 grams of bread daily, sometimes real butter instead of the chalky margarine that civilians choked down. She had felt guilty about this small abundance, sneaking food home to Greta whenever possible, watching her sister devour a piece of military-issue bread with the intensity of someone dying of thirst finding water. The propaganda had assured them that everyone was sacrificing equally, that the British were starving, that the Americans were suffering under their own rationing. The newsreels showed German soldiers well-fed and strong, never mentioned the desperate telegrams from the Eastern Front describing men eating leather boots and tree bark. Never acknowledged that by 1944, the average German woman was consuming fewer calories than a medieval peasant during famine. Adelheid had been captured outside Strasbourg, too exhausted to run when American tanks rolled through their position. She had expected immediate execution, or at minimum, the same brutal starvation her government claimed was being inflicted on German prisoners. Instead, within 6 hours of capture, she had been given white bread. Actual white bread, soft and fresh, with real butter. She had eaten it slowly, alone in a transport truck, and wept into her hands because something so simple should not have felt like a miracle. That bread should have prepared her for what was coming, should have warned her that everything she understood about the war, about the enemy, about who was winning and who was suffering, might be built on lies as substantial as sawdust stretched into bread. But nothing, not even that impossible white bread, could have prepared her for the sight of beef pot pie being served as ordinary prison food on an ordinary Tuesday evening in November. The journey from Europe to America had taken 3 weeks, and every day of it had challenged what Ingeborg Richter thought she knew about how enemies treated their captives. She had boarded the transport ship at Le Havre, expecting a floating hell. Cramped holds where prisoners were stacked like cargo, minimal food, perhaps beatings from guards who saw them as representatives of the regime that had killed their brothers and friends. Instead, she found herself in quarters that, while certainly not luxurious, were cleaner and more spacious than the barracks she had occupied while serving the Wehrmacht. The ship's hold had been converted into sleeping areas with actual bunks, thin mattresses that were nonetheless more comfortable than the straw pallets she had grown accustomed to. There were bathrooms with running water, a luxury that had become increasingly rare in Germany as infrastructure crumbled under Allied bombing. The other women, 58 of them ranging from 18 to 34, had moved through those first days in a state of anxious confusion. They whispered to each other in German, trying to understand why their captors were not matching the image of brutal American soldiers that propaganda had burned into their minds. Mechthild Schneider, the 25-year-old medical orderly from Dortmund, had been the first to voice what they were all thinking. "They feed us 3 times daily," she said on the 4th day at sea, her voice low and uncertain. "Not scraps, actual meals. Bread, soup with vegetables, sometimes tinned meat. More food than I received while serving in field hospitals." The observation hung in the air like an accusation, not against the Americans, but against something larger that none of them wanted to examine too closely. Lieselotte Bauer, 20 years old, and still carrying the idealistic fervor that had led her to volunteer for the Auxiliary Corps, had tried to maintain the narratives they had all been taught. "It is strategy," she insisted, her young face set with determination. "They fatten us for propaganda purposes, to show the world how humane they are while they bomb our cities and kill our families." But even as she spoke, doubt flickered in her eyes. Roswitha Wagner had said nothing during these debates. The 23-year-old administrative specialist from Augsburg had spent the entire war processing paperwork, watching numbers that represented rations shrink month by month, while official reports claimed Germany was thriving. She had learned to recognize the gap between what officials said and what reality showed. Now eating her 3rd meal of the day aboard an American transport ship, she understood that the gap was not a crack but a chasm, and that Everything on the other side of it would require her to rebuild her understanding of the world from the foundation up. Fort Lawton materialized through the gray November rain like something from a fever dream. Edeltraud Hoffman pressed her face against the transport truck's canvas opening, watching American soil approach with a mixture of dread and exhausted curiosity. She had spent 25 months as a field nurse, had seen bombed cities and dying soldiers, had developed the hardened exterior necessary to function in a world of constant trauma. Nothing in that experience had prepared her for what she saw as they passed through the camp gates. American soldiers were everywhere, and they looked healthy. Not the wan, stretched healthiness of people surviving on rations, but genuine vitality. Their uniforms fit properly, not hanging loose on frames depleted by inadequate nutrition. They moved with energy that spoke of bodies receiving enough fuel to function optimally. Some were laughing, actually laughing, as if joy was something still permitted during wartime. One group sat outside a building eating sandwiches during their break, and Edeltraud watched in disbelief as one soldier took 2 bites of his sandwich, decided he did not want it, and casually tossed the remainder into a waste bin. She turned to Adelheid, gripping her arm with fingers that had forgotten how to be gentle. "Did you see that? He threw away food. He threw it away." Adelheid had seen it. They had all seen it. The casual waste spoke louder than any propaganda ever could about the fundamental difference between their world and this one. In Germany, throwing away food was not merely wasteful, it was obscene. It was a crime that could result in arrest. It was something so unthinkable that children were beaten for leaving crumbs on their plates. Yet here was an American soldier discarding half a sandwich as if food was so abundant that waste carried no moral weight. The women were processed through intake with an efficiency that felt almost gentle. American female officers, members of the WAC, conducted the paperwork and basic medical examinations. They were professional but not cruel, bored rather than hostile. One of them, a lieutenant with tired eyes and a Boston accent, actually apologized when the medical examination took longer than expected. "Sorry for the wait," she said in English that Ingeborg partially understood. "We were not expecting you all until tomorrow." The barracks they were assigned to were simple but clean, with real beds and blankets that smelled of soap rather than mildew and unwashed bodies. There were windows with glass that was not broken, floors that had been swept recently, a stove for heat that actually worked. Roswitha sat on her assigned bunk and felt the mattress beneath her, thin but present, and realized she was going to cry, not from fear or relief or any single emotion, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of discovering that prison in America was more comfortable than service to the fatherland had been. The second week at Fort Lawton brought routine, and with routine came the dangerous possibility of adjustment. Adelheid found herself falling into patterns that felt almost normal, waking to bells instead of air raid sirens, eating meals at regular intervals, sleeping without the fear that bombs might tear through the ceiling at any moment. The American guards maintained professional distance, but showed no active cruelty. They walked the perimeter, checked doors at night, conducted roll call each morning with the bored efficiency of men performing tasks they found tedious rather than important. It was Corporal James Mitchell, a skinny young man from somewhere called Idaho, who first mentioned the special meal. He was making his rounds on a Tuesday afternoon when he paused near where Ingeborg was sweeping the barrack steps. "Big dinner tonight," he said in English, then added with hand gestures when he saw her confusion, "Good food. Very good." He patted his stomach and smiled before continuing his patrol. Ingeborg carried the information inside like a fragile object, turning it over in her mind before sharing it with the others. Special meal. What could that mean in a place where regular meals already exceeded anything they had known in years? Mechthild was the first to voice the question that would consume them for the next 4 hours. "Perhaps it is a holiday," she suggested, lying on her bunk and staring at the ceiling. "Do Americans celebrate something in November?" Lisa sat up with sudden excitement that made her look even younger than her 20 years. "A wedding," she breathed, and the word hung in the air like a spell. "It must be a wedding. One of the officers is getting married, and they are having a celebration." The idea took hold with the power of desperate hope. Roswitha remembered weddings before the war when her cousin had married in 1938, and there had been roasted pork, 3 kinds of bread, actual butter cake with real sugar and eggs. Weddings were the last bastions of abundance in a world of scarcity, the final occasions where German families pooled resources and ration cards to create one day of plenty amid years of want. "My sister got married in 1943, Edeltraud said quietly, her nurse's hands folding and refolding a handkerchief in her lap. "We saved for 6 months, every spare gram of flour, every bit of sugar, every egg we could trade for or hide from requisitions. The meal lasted 20 minutes, 20 minutes of feeling like the world was still normal." Adelheid closed her eyes and remembered her best friend's wedding in 1942, how the bride had cried, not from joy, but from the overwhelming relief of having enough food on the table that guests would not leave hungry. How they had all dressed in their best remaining clothes and pretended that the hollows in their cheeks were just the fashionable angles of modern beauty rather than the geography of starvation. If the Americans were having a wedding feast, if they were generous enough to include their prisoners in the celebration, then perhaps this place was even stranger than they had imagined. Perhaps captivity in America meant participating in the last fragments of civilian normalcy that their own country had sacrificed years ago. The rumor spread through the barracks like fever, each woman adding her own memories and interpretations until the simple announcement of a special dinner had transformed into an elaborate fantasy of American abundance. Roswitha found herself at the center of the speculation, her administrative mind cataloging details the others seemed to overlook. "If it is a wedding, there will be a cake," she said with the authority of someone who had processed requisition forms for military celebrations. Americans value cake highly. Their films always show enormous cakes at weddings, white with many layers. Lisa, who had been 16 when the war began and could barely remember peacetime plenty, listened with the intensity of someone hearing fairy tales. "My mother told me about weddings before rationing. There would be roasted meats, multiple kinds, beef and pork and sometimes chicken, all at the same meal, potatoes prepared in different ways, vegetables that were not turnips, bread with butter that you did not have to ration by the gram." Mechthild laughed, but it was the brittle laugh of someone who had stopped believing in such abundance. "Your mother was telling you stories, Lotta. No one eats like that, not even before the war." But even as she spoke, she was remembering her own grandmother's descriptions of harvest festivals in the 1920s, tables that groaned under the weight of food that was not carefully calculated and divided, but simply abundant, extravagant, wasteful, in ways that now seemed almost sinful. Edeltraud had been quiet during most of the speculation, but now she spoke with the precision of someone who had seen both plenty and want. "I attended a general's wedding in Berlin in 1941 before I was sent to the field hospitals. The Nazi elite still had access to everything. I watched them serve roasted duck, 3 kinds of potato, cream sauces, pastries filled with real chocolate. The guests ate until they were full and then kept eating because the food was there and beautiful and they could." The memory seemed to pain her, and Adelheid understood why. To have served a regime that let its elite feast while its people starved, to have been part of a system that hoarded abundance for the chosen while others scraped by on turnips and sawdust bread. The knowledge sat heavy in all of them, but they had not known how to name it until they had seen American soldiers casually throwing away food, until they had eaten 3 meals a day as prisoners and realized their own government had never fed them so well, even when they were serving it faithfully. "If there is a wedding tonight," Ingeborg said slowly, thinking through the implications, "and if they include us in the celebration, it means they see us as human enough to share their joy with. Not enemies, not prisoners to be punished, but people who deserved to witness happiness. The thought was more dangerous than any propaganda they had been taught. It suggested that perhaps the Americans had never seen them as monsters deserving destruction, but simply as people on the wrong side of a conflict, worthy of basic human dignity even in defeat. The mess hall doors opened at 1700 hours exactly, and Adelheid felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she filed in with the other women. They had spent the afternoon preparing as if for a formal occasion, brushing out their prison-issue uniforms, braiding hair with the careful attention of women who had not had reason to care about appearance in months. The speculation about a wedding had taken on the weight of certainty, and now they entered the dining hall with the hushed reverence of guests arriving at a sacred ceremony. What they found was not a wedding. There was no decorated table, no bride in white, no gathering of celebratory families dressed in their finest remaining clothes. Instead, there were simply the usual long tables and benches, the usual American guards standing at their usual posts, the usual institutional efficiency of a military dining facility at dinner time. But the smell. The smell was anything but usual. It rolled over them like a physical force, rich and complex and impossible. Butter. Beef. Herbs they could not immediately identify. Pastry baking to golden perfection. The scent contained more fat, more protein, more abundance than their noses had encountered in years. And several women stopped walking, simply stopped in the doorway, as if the smell itself was a barrier they needed permission to cross. Then they saw the pies, dozens of them, perhaps 50 or more, lined up on the serving counter in neat rows. Each one sat in a white ceramic dish, and from each one rose a golden pastry crust that looked like something from a cookbook photograph, from a magazine advertisement, from the kind of fantasy world where food was beautiful rather than merely functional. Steam escaped from decorative vents cut into the tops, and through those small openings they could see darkness that suggested gravy, chunks of something that might be meat, the promise of filling substantial enough to satisfy rather than merely stave off hunger for another few hours. Corporal Mitchell was serving, using a large spoon to scoop generous portions onto metal trays. He was smiling, chatting with other guards in English, too rapid for most of the women to follow, completely unaware that he was presiding over something that felt like a religious revelation. Adelheid watched him place a serving on a tray, watched the way the crust cracked slightly under the weight of the spoon, releasing more of that impossible steam. The portion was enormous, larger than any single serving she had received in 3 years. It filled the compartment of the tray completely, gravy pooling at the edges, chunks of carrot and potato visible among the beef. This was not wedding food. This was not celebration food saved for rare occasions through months of sacrifice and careful hoarding. This was, according to the casual attitude of every American in the room, simply dinner, simply Tuesday, simply what people ate when there was nothing special to celebrate except the ordinary continuation of existence in a world where food was abundant enough that no one needed to weep over it. Mechthild reached the serving line with legs that felt disconnected from her body, moving through some automation of muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Corporal Mitchell smiled at her, that easy American smile that still unsettled her because it seemed to contain no calculation, no hidden cruelty waiting to manifest. He said something in English, words she did not catch over the roaring in her ears, and placed a pot pie on her tray. The weight of it registered immediately, substantial and real. She stared down at the golden crust, at the way butter glistened on the surface, at the perfect crimping around the edges that spoke of someone who had time and resources enough to care about presentation. Her hands began to shake. The tray rattled slightly, and Corporal Mitchell's smile faded into concern. He said something else, probably asking if she was all right, but Mechthild could not form words in any language. Behind her, Lieselotte was asking questions in her careful, accented English. "This is for wedding? For celebration?" Corporal Mitchell looked confused. "Wedding? No, miss. Just dinner. Beef pot pie. Cook makes it every couple weeks. He gestured toward the kitchen where they could see the cook, a heavy-set man with flour on his apron, pulling more pies from industrial ovens every couple weeks. The words penetrated slowly, working their way through layers of disbelief that had calcified over years of rationing. This abundance, this extravagance of butter and beef and vegetables encased in pastry that required eggs and milk and flour in quantities that seemed obscene, this was routine, this was ordinary. This was what Americans considered unremarkable enough to serve on a Tuesday evening to prisoners of war. Ingeborg had reached her assigned table but could not sit. She stood holding her tray, looking down at the pot pie as if it might disappear if she blinked. Other women gathered around, their own trays laden with identical portions, all of them frozen in the same moment of cognitive collapse. "It cannot be normal food," Edeltraud whispered. "No country feeds its prisoners this way. No country has enough food to make this normal." But Roswitha was watching the American guards, watching them collect their own servings and sit down at their tables with the bored contentment of men eating familiar food. She saw one guard, a sergeant with gray at his temples, cut into his pot pie without ceremony, without reverence, without the careful attention one gave to precious things. He ate several bites while reading a newspaper, then paused to chat with the man next to him, his fork resting casually in the remains of his dinner. This was not special to him. This was not a gift or a treat or a rare moment of plenty. This was just food. Good, consumed with the same casual indifference that German soldiers might have shown toward turnip soup before the soup itself became a luxury. Adelheid sat down slowly, placing her tray on the table with exaggerated care. The pot pie sat before her, radiating heat and the promise of satisfaction. She had been taught that Americans were suffering, that their country was straining under the weight of war production, that their people were making sacrifices similar to those demanded of Germans. Every newsreel, every propaganda broadcast, every official communication had reinforced this narrative. The pot pie before her was not just food, it was evidence. It was testimony, it was proof that everything she had been told was a lie. Ingeborg picked up her fork with a hand that trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. Around her, the other women sat in silence, all of them staring at their trays as if the pot pies might vanish like mirages. The American guards had begun eating, their conversations creating a backdrop of casual normalcy that made the Germans' paralysis more obvious by contrast. Corporal Mitchell walked past their table, noticed their untouched food, and paused with concern on his young face. "Something wrong? You don't like pot pie?" He mimed eating, encouraging them with gestures that would have been comical in any other circumstance. Adelheid forced herself to respond to break through the paralysis that had seized her entire body. She cut into the crust with her fork, and it yielded with the tender flakiness that came from proper butter and careful preparation. The pastry crumbled slightly, releasing another wave of that overwhelming scent. Beneath it, she found thick gravy, darker than she expected, rich with the essence of slow-cooked meat. She lifted a forkful, holding it before her eyes as if examining a scientific specimen. A chunk of beef, larger than her thumb, 2 pieces of carrot, a potato slice. All of it coated in gravy that was not thin and watery, but substantial, clinging to the food with the weight that came from flour and fat. This single forkful contained more calories than some entire meals she had eaten in the last year. She placed it in her mouth and closed her eyes. The explosion of flavor was almost painful. Her palate, accustomed to bland turnip soup and sawdust bread, recoiled from the richness before accepting it with desperate gratitude. The beef was tender, falling apart under gentle pressure from her tongue, seasoned with herbs she could not identify, but which tasted like some memory of her grandmother's kitchen before the war had consumed everything normal. The gravy carried the deep, complex flavor that only came from proper stock, from bones that had been simmered for hours, from a kitchen that had time and resources to make food that was more than mere fuel. She swallowed, and immediately her body demanded more. Years of deprivation had rewired her responses to food, and now that she had tasted real abundance, every cell in her body was screaming for her to eat faster, to consume as much as possible before this impossible plenty disappeared. Around her, the other women had begun eating, and the sounds they made were not the sounds of dining, but of something more primal. Mechthild was crying openly, tears streaming down her face as she chewed, her shoulders shaking with sobs she tried to suppress. Lieselota had both hands wrapped around her fork as if someone might try to take it from her, shoveling food into her mouth with the mechanical intensity of a starving animal. Edeltraud ate slowly, methodically, but her eyes were closed and her face showed an expression that was almost like pain. Roswitha had stopped after 3 bites, her fork resting on her tray, her face pale. "I cannot," she whispered. "It is too much. My stomach has forgotten how to process real food." But even as she spoke, she was cutting another piece, unable to resist despite the physical discomfort of a digestive system shocked by sudden richness after years of deprivation. Adelheid sat back from her half-finished pot pie, physically unable to eat more, but mentally unable to stop staring at what remained. Her stomach, shrunken from years of inadequate rations, felt painfully full after consuming only half the serving. In Germany, this amount would have been divided among 4 people and considered a feast. Here, it was one person's ordinary dinner, and American soldiers around them were finishing their portions without difficulty, their bodies accustomed to abundance. The realization settled over her like cold water, washing away the last remnants of the worldview she had carried from Germany. The propaganda had told them that America was struggling, that their entry into the war had devastated their economy, that their people were suffering shortages similar to those in Germany. She had seen newsreels showing American housewives complaining about rationing, holding up ration books, while announcers mocked their selfishness and inability to sacrifice properly. But those newsreels had been lies, or at minimum, grotesque distortions of scale. American rationing meant choosing between beef and pork, between butter and margarine. It meant limits on sugar and coffee that would have seemed like luxury to Germans who had not seen real coffee since 1941. It meant being asked to sacrifice some abundance rather than being slowly starved by a government that could not feed its people while maintaining its war machine. Ingeborg was thinking along the same lines, her analytical mind already calculating the implications. "If they feed their prisoners like this," she said quietly in German, "how do they feed their civilians, their soldiers?" The question hung in the air, and none of them wanted to follow the logic to its conclusion. But the conclusion was inevitable, written in the golden crust of the pot pie, in the casual waste they had witnessed, in the healthy bodies of American guards who had never known the gnawing hunger that defined German existence. Germany was not winning the war. Germany had never been winning the war. The victories they had been told about, the triumphs that newsreels celebrated, were temporary advances by a country that could not sustain its own population, let alone a prolonged conflict with a nation that made beef pot pie ordinary prison food. Mechthild spoke the thought they were all having. Everything was a lie. Every broadcast, every speech, every promise that we were defending the fatherland against enemies who wanted to destroy us. They were not trying to destroy us. We were destroying ourselves. Edeltraud's nurse training had made her attentive to physical symptoms, and now she looked around the table at her fellow prisoners with clinical assessment. "Look at us. We have been here 2 weeks, 2 weeks of regular meals, of food that is merely adequate by American standards, and already our skin looks better, our eyes are clearer. Greta has stopped having dizzy spells. Anna's hair has stopped falling out." The evidence was undeniable. Captivity in America was healing them in ways that service to Germany had damaged them. They were becoming healthier as prisoners than they had been as auxiliaries serving their own country. The betrayal of that realization was almost worse than the physical hunger had been. They had suffered willingly, believing their sacrifice was necessary, that their deprivation was shared equally across their nation in service of a righteous cause. Now they understood that their suffering had been both unnecessary and unequal, that their leaders had lied about everything while hoarding resources for themselves and conducting a war their country could never sustain. Corporal Mitchell returned to their table 20 minutes later, his young face showing concern that seemed genuine rather than tactical. He looked at their trays, at the half-eaten pot pies and the tear-stained faces, and his confusion was evident even across the language barrier. "You don't like it?" he asked, gesturing at the food, with the bewilderment of someone who had never considered that pot pie might provoke tears rather than satisfaction. "Cook's real good at pot pie, best in the whole camp." Ingeborg tried to explain in her limited English, searching for words that could bridge the impossible gap between their experiences. "It is very good, too good. We are not accustomed to such food." Mitchell's confusion deepened. "Too good? That don't make sense, miss. It's just pot pie, nothing fancy." He looked toward the kitchen as if seeking evidence that the cook had done something unusual. Adelheid attempted to help, her own English halting but determined. "In Germany, we do not have this food. Long time we do not have beef, butter, such things." Mitchell processed this slowly, his Iowa farm boy face working through the implications. "You mean like you didn't get this in the prisoner camps before? The Germans didn't feed you good?" "No," Mechthild interjected, her English surprisingly clear despite her tears. "In Germany, before capture. When we serve Germany, we do not have this food, not for years." The understanding that crossed Mitchell's face was almost comical in its shock. "Wait, you're saying that back home in Germany regular folks don't eat like this? Even before you got captured?" The women nodded in unison, and Mitchell sat down on the bench uninvited, his guard duties temporarily forgotten in the face of this revelation. "But you guys are fighting a whole war. How do you fight without feeding your people proper?" It was perhaps the most devastating question he could have asked, innocent in its delivery, but cutting to the heart of everything they were beginning to understand. Roswitha answered in careful English, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood she was admitting something shameful. "We were told everyone sacrifices in war. We were told America also starves, also struggles. We were told we fight because we must, and after victory, food returns." Mitchell shook his head slowly, processing this information with visible difficulty. "Ma'am, I'm just a farm kid from Iowa, but even with rationing, my ma serves pot pie every Sunday, has since I was little. We got limits on some things, sure, but nobody's starving. We got more food than we know what to do with, most times." The simple statement landed like an artillery shell. Nobody's starving, more food than we know what to do with. The casual American abundance, so ordinary that a farm boy from Iowa considered it unremarkable, stood in stark contrast to years of German deprivation. Mitchell stood up, still shaking his head. "That ain't right. That just ain't right. You ladies should eat as much as you can hold. Get some proper meals in you." That night, Adelheid lay on her bunk with her stomach uncomfortably full and her mind unable to rest. The pot pie sat heavy in her belly, not painfully but noticeably, a physical reminder that her body had forgotten how to process real abundance. Around her, the other women were similarly sleepless, their breathing patterns revealing that none of them had found the escape of unconsciousness despite their exhaustion. Mechthild finally broke the silence. "I keep thinking about my last meal in Germany. The last meal before capture." Her voice carried through the dark barracks, and others shifted on their bunks, listening. It was October 3rd, morning rations, one slice of black bread 9 centimeters thick. They measured it with a ruler to ensure fairness, 20 grams of margarine, but it was mostly water and chalk. Ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. That was breakfast. Lunch was cabbage soup, mostly water, perhaps 10 small pieces of cabbage floating in it. Lawton spoke next, her young voice carrying the bitterness of someone who felt cheated of proper youth. My sister's baby died in August, 10 months old. The doctor said malnutrition, but officially they wrote respiratory failure because admitting we could not feed our children was defeatist talk. The confession hung in the darkness, and several women made small sounds of recognition, of shared loss. My brother in Stalingrad, Edeltraud said quietly. His last letter, before the silence, he wrote about eating rats. They were grateful for rats because it was protein. He made jokes about it, tried to be cheerful, but I could read between the lines. He was starving, and there was no supply line coming, and he knew it. Ingeborg's analytical mind was working even now, calculating and comparing. The pot pie we ate tonight, one serving, contained approximately 600 calories, perhaps more with the butter in the crust. In Germany, our daily ration for civilians was 1,200 calories by 1944, but actual distribution was less, perhaps 900 calories on good days. The numbers meant something to all of them, but Roswitha put it into starker terms. That means one American prison dinner equals more than half a day's rations for German civilians, and they eat 3 meals like this daily. Adelheid thought about her family in Essen, wondered if they were still alive after months of bombing raids. If they survived, what were they eating tonight? Her mother, her sister Greta, who had been 13 and always hungry, her father, who had given up his portions so his daughters could eat slightly more. Were they dividing a single potato among 3 people, making soup from nettles gathered in bombed-out lots, trading family heirlooms for a few eggs on the black market? The guilt of her full stomach warred with the anger of understanding how unnecessary their suffering had been. "We cannot go back," Mechthild said suddenly, and though she did not explain further, they all understood. She did not mean they could not physically return to Germany. She meant they could not return to believing what they had believed, to serving a system they now understood had betrayed them fundamentally. Morning brought another substantial breakfast, and the women ate with the conflicted desperation of people who could not reconcile their hunger with their guilt. Scrambled eggs made with real eggs, not the yellow powder that had passed for eggs in Germany. Toast from white bread, not the dark sawdust mixture they had choked down for years. Bacon, actual pork bacon, crispy and salty and obscenely abundant. Coffee that smelled like coffee rather than burnt grain. Adelheid watched Corporal Mitchell pour her coffee from a large pot, filling her cup without measuring, without rationing, simply pouring until the cup was full, because there was enough coffee that individual portions did not need to be calculated. The gesture was more devastating than the pot pie had been, because it spoke to a depth of abundance that went beyond special meals to encompass every aspect of daily life. After breakfast, the women gathered in the common area, ostensibly for their daily work assignments, but actually for a conversation that had been building since the previous night. Edeltraud spoke first, her nurse's directness cutting through any pretense. "We need to discuss what happens when the war ends, when they offer us repatriation." The word hung heavy in the air. Repatriation. Return to the fatherland. Return to the country that had starved them, while telling them it was necessary, that had lied to them while sending their brothers and fathers to die in unwinnable campaigns, that had committed atrocities they were only now beginning to learn about through American newspapers. "I have no family left," Mechthild said flatly. "My parents died in the Dresden bombing. My brother was at Stalingrad. I received notice of his death 3 days before capture. There is no one waiting for me in Germany." Several others nodded, their faces showing the same hollow recognition of loss. The war had taken so much from all of them, and what remained in Germany was rubble and starvation and the long process of reckoning with what their country had become. Lawton, young and still clinging to fragments of loyalty, tried to argue, "But it is our home. Our country needs us to rebuild. We cannot abandon Germany when it needs us most." Ingeborg's response was gentle but firm. What Germany needs is people who have not been so damaged by starvation that they cannot work. What Germany needs is resources that do not exist. What Germany needs is a miracle, and we are not that miracle." Roswitha had been quiet, but now she spoke with the measured consideration of someone who had been thinking deeply. "The question is not whether Germany needs us. The question is what we owe to a country that lied to us about everything." The American Red Cross provided paper, envelopes, and postage for prisoners to write home, a courtesy that seemed almost absurd, given that their captors were more generous than their own government had ever been. Ingeborg sat in the common area with blank paper before her, pen in hand, trying to find words that could bridge the impossible distance between her current reality and what her sister in Mannheim would understand. How could she explain that she ate better as a prisoner than she ever had while serving the Reich? How could she describe the cognitive dissonance of being treated with more dignity by her enemies than by her own commanders? She began carefully, her handwriting precise despite the tremor in her fingers. "Dear Helene, I am safe and well treated in American captivity. The conditions here are better than I can adequately explain. We receive 3 meals daily, with portions that would seem impossible to you." She paused, reading what she had written, knowing it would sound like propaganda or delusion to anyone still in Germany. She continued anyway because her sister deserved truth, even if truth seemed fantastic. "Yesterday we were served beef pot pie. Real beef, Helene, with butter, pastry, and vegetables. A single serving contained more meat than our entire family saw in a month. The Americans feed this to their prisoners routinely, not as special celebration, but as ordinary dinner." Tears blurred her vision as she wrote, thinking of Helene in their family's apartment, if it still stood after the bombings, dividing inadequate rations, growing thinner each week while official broadcasts promised victory was near. "I do not know how to tell you this without seeming to have lost my mind, but I believe we were lied to about everything. The Americans are not starving. They have more food than they need. Their soldiers are healthy and well fed. Their prisoners eat better than their enemies' civilians." Around her, other women were writing similar letters, each struggling with the same impossible task of describing abundance to people who knew only scarcity. Mechthild had given up on explanation and was simply listing food items, a catalog of plenty that would read like fantasy. Real eggs, white bread, fresh milk, beef, pork, chicken, butter, cheese, coffee, chocolate. The list continued down the page, stark and undeniable. Lieselotte was crying as she wrote to her mother, her young face twisted with guilt. "Mama, I am so sorry. I am sorry that I am eating well while you starve. I am sorry that I believed what they told us. I am sorry that my captivity is more comfortable than your freedom." Adelheid had written 3 drafts and torn them all up, unable to find words that felt adequate. How could she tell her family that she was considering not returning? How could she explain that the country that had defeated them seemed to offer more hope than the country she had served? Finally, she wrote simply, "I am alive, I am fed, I am learning that the world is different than we were taught. I love you all. I do not know when or if I will see you again, but know that I think of you constantly." She sealed the envelope before she could reconsider, addressing it to her family home in Essen and praying it still existed to receive mail. 3 weeks after the pot pie dinner, the physical changes in the women were becoming undeniable. Edeltraud conducted informal medical assessments during their morning routines, her nurse's eye cataloging improvements that spoke to the power of adequate nutrition. Mechthild's chronic dizziness had vanished within 10 days of regular meals. The tremor in Lieselotte's hands, which she had attributed to nerves but which was actually mild malnutrition, had steadied. Roswitha's hair, which had been falling out in alarming quantities, had stopped shedding and was beginning to regain some of its former thickness. Ingeborg's persistent cough, which had plagued her for 8 months, had finally cleared. Most noticeably, their faces were filling out, the sharp angles of starvation softening as their bodies remembered what adequate fat stores felt like. They were not becoming plump, American rations for prisoners were substantial, but not excessive. But they were becoming healthy in ways they had forgotten were possible. The transformation was not merely physical. With proper nutrition came energy they had not experienced in years. Tasks that would have left them exhausted after months of inadequate food now felt manageable. Conversations became more animated as brain fog lifted with improved caloric intake. Even their emotional state shifted, the constant, low-grade anxiety that accompanied chronic hunger easing into something approaching stability. Adelheid caught her reflection in a window one morning and barely recognized herself. Her cheeks had color again. Her eyes looked brighter, less sunken. Her lips were no longer perpetually chapped from dehydration and vitamin deficiency. She looked, she realized with a shock, like she had before the war, like a woman in her 20s rather than someone decades older, worn down by deprivation. The Americans seemed to notice the changes with satisfaction that felt paternal rather than strategic. Corporal Mitchell commented one morning, "You ladies are looking a whole lot healthier, getting some meat on your bones. That's good to see." His casual observation carried weight the women felt deeply. They were becoming healthier in captivity than they had been in service. Their enemy was healing them while their own government had slowly destroyed them. The irony was not lost on any of them. But with improved health came improved capacity for clear thinking, and clear thinking brought uncomfortable questions to sharp focus. Lawton, whose youthful idealism had been the last holdout against doubt, finally spoke what they were all recognizing. If they can feed prisoners this well, if they have such abundance that even their captives grow healthy, then they were never in danger from us. Germany was never a threat to America. We were fighting a war we could never win against a country that could afford to be generous even to its enemies. The statement, once it was spoken aloud, could not be unspoken. January 1945 brought news that the war was entering its final phase. Germany was collapsing from both east and west, and American newspapers printed increasingly grim accounts of the devastation Allied forces were finding as they advanced. The prisoner camp at Fort Todd. Lawton received updates through official channels, and the American commanders began discussing repatriation procedures with a delicacy that suggested they understood how complicated the question had become. Captain Helen Morrison, the WAC officer who supervised the women's barracks, called a meeting in late January to discuss the inevitable process of return. She was a tall woman from Massachusetts with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of war to be kind rather than merely efficient. "Ladies," she began in careful English, speaking slowly so Ingeborg and others could translate for those with less language facility. "The war in Europe will end soon. When it does, procedures will begin to return prisoners to their home countries." She paused, watching their faces, and seemed to see something there that made her choose her next words carefully. "However, I want you to understand that repatriation is not immediate. The process takes time. There will be opportunities to communicate with your families, to understand what conditions you would be returning to before any final decisions are made." The careful phrasing was not lost on the women. Decisions, not mandates, not orders. Decisions that somehow implied they might have agency in the matter. Adelheid raised her hand, a gesture that felt absurdly formal given the intimacy that had developed over months of shared meals and conversations. "Captain Morrison, if someone does not wish to return immediately, is that possible?" The captain's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been sympathy. "These are questions above my authority, but I will say that the United States has procedures for refugees and displaced persons. Nothing is simple and nothing is guaranteed, but options exist beyond immediate repatriation." The meeting ended, but the conversations it sparked continued through the night. The women divided naturally into groups, those who felt duty-bound to return regardless of conditions, and those who were beginning to consider the unthinkable option of staying. Lisa was firm in her conviction to return. My mother is alone in Stuttgart. I cannot abandon her, regardless of how difficult conditions are. Several others echoed this sentiment, loyalty to family outweighing the comfort of American captivity. But Mechthild spoke for another faction. I have no family left. Germany holds nothing for me but memories of loss. Here I am fed. Here I am treated with dignity. Here I might build something new rather than spending years trying to resurrect something that is already dead. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with the strange quietness of an ending that everyone had seen coming, but which still carried the weight of finality. The war that had consumed their entire adult lives was over, and Germany had surrendered unconditionally. In the Fort Lawton barracks, the women gathered around a radio as so. President Truman's voice crackled through static, announcing the defeat of Nazi Germany and the beginning of whatever came next. Some wept, some sat in stunned silence. Lisa clutched a letter from her mother, received just 2 days earlier, confirming that Stuttgart still stood and that she was desperately awaiting her daughter's return. The repatriation process began immediately for those who wished to return. Captain Morrison explained the procedures with her characteristic efficiency, tempered by genuine concern. Ships would depart from Seattle in 3 weeks, carrying German prisoners back to displacement camps in Europe, where they would be processed and eventually released to whatever remained of their homes. 18 of the women signed up for immediate repatriation without hesitation. They packed their few belongings, wrote final letters to families who had waited years for their return, and prepared themselves for the difficult journey back to a defeated homeland. But when Captain Morrison asked for final confirmation of the repatriation list, 5 women did not raise their hands. Adelheid stood first, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. Captain Morrison, I wish to request consideration for displaced person status. I do not wish to return to Germany at this time. Beside her, Mechthild rose, then Ingeborg, then Edeltraud. Finally, Roswitha stood, her administrative mind having calculated every angle and reached a conclusion that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Captain Morrison showed no surprise, as if she had been expecting this. I will forward your requests to the appropriate authorities. You understand that this means you will no longer be prisoners of war. You will need to find sponsors, employment, and housing independently. We understand, Adelheid replied, speaking for all of them. We are willing to work. We simply ask for the opportunity to build new lives here rather than return to conditions we know offer no future. The decision fractured the group that had become something like family over the months of shared captivity. Those who were leaving felt the choice as a kind of betrayal, an abandonment of duty and homeland. Those who stayed felt the weight of judgment, the implication that they were taking the coward's path, choosing comfort over loyalty. Lieselotte was particularly bitter in her final days at Fort Lawton. She avoided Adelheid and the others, her young face set in lines of disapproval. When she finally spoke to them on her last evening, her words carried sting. You are choosing American food over German family. You are letting beef pot pie matter more than your own people. Mechthild responded with weary patience. We are choosing life over death. We are choosing to believe that we can contribute more by becoming something new, rather than by returning to help maintain something that was fundamentally broken. That is not betrayal, that is survival. The words satisfied neither side, but they were the truth as the 5 women understood it. They had found something in American captivity that they had never experienced in German freedom. 1970. 25 years after that November evening when beef pot pie shattered everything Adelheid Kruger thought she understood about the world. She stood in her kitchen in Portland, Oregon, teaching her 12-year-old granddaughter, Emma, how to make the same dish that had changed her life. The kitchen was warm and bright, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on a garden Adelheid had spent 2 decades cultivating. Her hands, now lined with age but steady and strong, crimped the edges of pastry crust with the same practiced efficiency she had learned from watching American cooks in that prison camp kitchen so many years ago. Emma watched with the focused intensity of a child who sensed she was being taught something more important than cooking. "Oma, why do you always cry when you make pot pie?" Adelheid paused, her fingers still pressed into the golden dough, and considered how to answer. How could she explain to this American child, born into abundance and peace, what it meant to taste that first bite of beef pot pie in 1944? "Because this dish taught me the most important lesson of my life," she said finally, resuming her work on the crust. "It taught me that everything I believed could be wrong, that my enemies could show me more kindness than my own government, that food is not just sustenance, but a form of truth." Emma frowned, trying to understand. "But it's just pot pie, Oma. We have it all the time." "Exactly," Adelheid smiled, sliding the dish into the oven. "You have it all the time. When I was your age in Germany, I was slowly starving while being told that everyone was starving, that our suffering was necessary and shared. That pot pie showed me the lie." She had told this story before to her daughter Sarah, to journalists who had interviewed her, to students at the local university who wanted to understand how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. Mechthild had died 3 years earlier, a successful surgical nurse who had spent her career healing others. Ingeborg had become a translator for the State Department, her gift for languages making her invaluable during the Cold War years. Edeltraud had married an American doctor and moved to Minnesota, where she raised 4 children and worked in public health. Roswitha had returned to Germany in 1960, not as a failure, but as a success, carrying with her the lessons of American democracy and helping to build the new Federal Republic. Only Adelheid had stayed in the Pacific Northwest, finding in the rainy climate and forested mountains something that felt like home. The timer rang, and she pulled the pot pie from the oven, its crust golden and perfect, steam rising from the decorative vents she had cut into the top. Emma leaned forward, breathing in the scent, and Adelheid saw in her granddaughter's casual appreciation the gift of a life lived without deprivation, without propaganda, without the kind of lies that required beef pot pie to shatter.